American ladies were invariably represented as pretty and well-shaped, in spite of Mr. Punch's purple anger at one Nathaniel Hawthorne, sometime American consul at Liverpool, who had brought out a book about England thoroughly saturated with what seems ill nature and spite, and making a savage onslaught upon our women. Excerpts are quoted, but I have space for only one. English girls seemed to me all homely alike. They seemed to be country lasses of sturdy and unwholesome aspect, with coarse-grained, cabbage-rosy cheeks. How unlike the trim little damsels of my native land. Mr. Punch hopes that Mr. Hawthorne will go on to write an autobiography, for Mr. Punch is very partial to essays on the natural history of half-civilized animals. I will close this survey with a typical illustrated joke of those years of pain and sorrow. It is labeled Gentle Rebuke, and the caption will give you some idea of what the drawing is like. Old Gentleman. How charmingly that young lady sings. Pray, who composed the beautiful song she has just favored us with? Lady of the house. Oh, it is by Mendelssohn. Old Gentleman. Ah, one of his famous songs without words, I suppose. Moral. Young ladies, when you sing, pronounce your words carefully, and then you will not expose unmusical old gentlemen to making such ridiculous mistakes as the above. Has anybody got any bound copies of old almanacs? The White Rabbit Caper, as the boys who turn out the mystery programs on the air might write a story for children. Fred Fox was pouring himself a slug of rye when the door of his office opened, and in hopped old Mrs. Rabbit. She was a white rabbit with pink eyes, and she wore a shawl on her head and gold-rimmed spectacles. "I want you to find Daphne," she said tearfully, and she handed Fred Fox a snapshot of a white rabbit with pink eyes that looked to him like a picture of every other white rabbit with pink eyes. "When did she hop the hutch?" asked Fred Fox. "Yesterday," said old Mrs. Rabbit. "She is only 18 months old, and I'm afraid that some superstitious creature has killed her for one of her feet." Fred Fox turned the snapshot over and put it in his pocket. "Has this bunny got a throb?" he asked. "Yes," said old Mrs. Rabbit. "France Frog, repulsive owner of the notorious Lily Pad nightclub." Fred Fox leaped to his feet. "Come on, Grandma," he said, "and don't step on your ears. We gotta move fast." On the way to the Lily Pad nightclub, old Mrs. Rabbit scampered so fast that Fred Fox had all he could do to keep up with her. "Daphne is my great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, if my memory serves," said old Mrs. Rabbit. "I have 39,000 descendants." "This isn't going to be easy," said Fred Fox. "Maybe you should have gone to a magician with a hat." "But she is the only one named Daphne," said old Mrs. Rabbit, "and she lived alone with me on my great carrot farm." They came to a broad brook. "Skip it," said Fred Fox. "Keep a civil tongue in your head, young man," snapped old Mrs. Rabbit. Just as they got to the lily pad, a dandelion clock struck 12 noon. Fred Fox pushed the button on the great green door, on which was painted a white water lily. The door opened 1/8 of an inch, and Ben Rat peered out. "Beat it," he said. But Fred Fox shoved the door open, and old Mrs. Rabbit followed him into a cool green hallway, softly but restlessly lighted by thousands of fireflies imprisoned in the hollow crystal pendants of an enormous chandelier. At the right, there was a flight of green-carpeted stairs, and at the bottom of the steps the door to the cloakroom. Straight ahead at the end of the long hallway was the cool green door to Franz Frog's office. "Beat it," said Ben Rat again. "Nice talk," said Fred Fox, "or I'll seal your house up with tin. Where's the croaker?" "Once a gumpaw, always a gumpaw," grumbled Ben Rat. "He's in his office." "With Daphne?" "Who's Daphne?" asked Ben Rat. "My great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter," said old Mrs. Rabbit. "Nobody's that great," snarled Ben Rat. Fred Fox opened the cool green door and went into Franz Frog's office, followed by old Mrs. Rabbit and Ben Rat. The owner of the lily pad sat behind his desk wearing a green suit, green shirt, green tie, green socks, and green shoes. He had an emerald tie-pin and several emerald rings. "Wong you wong, funks," he rumbled in a cold, green, cavernous voice. His eyes bulged, and his throat began to swell ominously. "He's going to croak," explained Ben Rat. "Nuts," said Fred Fox. "He'll outlive all of us." "Glunk," croaked Franz Frog. Ben Rat glared at Fred Fox. "You ought to go on the stage," he snarled. "Where's Daphne?" demanded Fred Fox. "Hung dang," asked Franz Frog. "Your bunny friend," said Fred Fox. "Nong," said Franz Frog. Fred Fox picked up a cello in a corner and put it down. It was too light to contain a rabbit. The front doorbell rang. "I'll get it," said Fred Fox. It was Oliver Hoot Owl, a notorious fly-by-night. "What are you doing up at this hour, Hoot?" asked Fred Fox. "I'm trying to blind myself, so I'll confess," said Hoot Owl testily. "Confess to what?" snapped Fred Fox. "What can't you solve?" asked Hoot Owl. "The disappearance of Daphne," said Fred Fox. "Who's Daphne?" asked Hoot Owl. Franz Frog hopped out of his office into the hall. Ben Rat and old Mrs. Rabbit followed him. Down the steps from the second floor came Sherman Stork, carrying a white muffler, or something, and grinning foolishly. "Well, bless my soul," said Fred Fox, "if it isn't old Mid-Husband himself. What did you do with Daphne?" "Who's Daphne?" asked Sherman Stork. "Fox thinks somebody killed Daphne Rabbit," said Ben Rat. "Fungs kung brung," rumbled Franz Frog. "I could be wrong," said Fred Fox, "but I'm not." He pulled open the cloakroom door at the bottom of the steps, and the dead body of a female white rabbit toppled furrily onto the cool green carpet. Her head had been bashed in by a heavy blunt instrument. "Daphne!" screamed old Mrs. Rabbit, bursting into tears. "I can't see a thing," said Hoot Owl. "It's a dead white rabbit," said Ben Rat. "Anybody can see that. You're dumb." "I'm wise," said Hoot Owl indignantly. "I know everything." "Jane Crine," moaned Franz Frog. He stared up at the chandelier, his eyes bulging and his mammoth mouth gaping open. All the fireflies were frightened and went out. The cool green hallway became pitch dark. There was a shriek in the black and a feathery plump. The fireflies lighted up to see what had happened. Hoot Owl lay dead on the cool green carpet, his head bashed in by a heavy blunt instrument. Ben Rat, Franz Frog, Sherman Stork, old Mrs. Rabbit, and Fred Fox stared at Hoot Owl. Over the cool green carpet crawled a warm red stain, whose source was the body of Hoot Owl. He lay like a feather duster. "Murder!" squealed old Mrs. Rabbit. "Nobody leaves this hallway," snapped Fred Fox. "There's a killer loose in this club." "I am not used to death," said Sherman Stork. "Wrong," groaned Franz Frog. "He says he's ruined," said Ben Rat, but Fred Fox wasn't listening. He was looking for a heavy blunt instrument. There wasn't any. "Search them," cried old Mrs. Rabbit. "Somebody has a sap or a sock full of sand or something." "Yeah," said Fred Fox. "Ben Rat is a sap. Maybe someone swung him by the tail." "You ought to go on the stage," snarled Ben Rat. Fred Fox searched the suspects, but he found no concealed weapon. "You could have strangled them with that muffler," Fred Fox told Sherman Stork. "But they were not strangled," said Sherman Stork. Fred Fox turned to Ben Rat. "You could have bitten them to death with your ugly teeth," he said. "But they weren't bitten to death," said Ben Rat. Fred Fox stared at Franz Frog. "You could have scared them to death with your ugly face," he said. "Bung wung scring kajing," said Franz Frog. "You're right," admitted Fred Fox. "They weren't." "Where's old Mrs. Rabbit?" he asked suddenly. "I'm hiding in here," called old Mrs. Rabbit from the cloakroom. "I'm frightened." Fred Fox got her out of the cool green sanctuary and went in himself. It was dark. He groped around on the cool green carpet. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he found it, a small object lying in a far corner. He put it in his pocket and came out of the cloakroom. "What'd you find, Seamus?" asked Ben Rat apprehensively. "Exhibit A," said Fred Fox casually. "Song plang king," moaned Franz Frog. "He says somebody's playing for keeps," said Ben Rat. "He can say that again," said Fred Fox as the front door was flung open, and Inspector Mastiff trotted in, followed by Sergeant Dachshund. "Well, well, look who's muzzling in," said Fred Fox. "What have we got here?" barked Inspector Mastiff. "I hate a private nose," said Sergeant Dachshund. Fred Fox grinned at him. "What happened to your legs from the knees down, sport?" he asked. "Drop dead," snarled Sergeant Dachshund. "Quiet, both of you," snapped Inspector Mastiff. "I know Ollie Owl, but who's the $20 Easter present from Schrafft's?" He turned on Fred Fox. "If this bunny's head comes off and she's filled with candy, I'll have your badge, Fox," he growled. "She's real, Inspector," said Fred Fox. "Real dead, too. How did you pick up the scent?" Inspector Mastiff howled. "The sergeant thought he smelled a rat at the Lily Club," he said. "Wrong again, as usual. Who's this dead rabbit?" "She's my great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter," sobbed old Mrs. Rabbit. Fred Fox lighted a cigarette. "Oh, no, she isn't, sweetheart," he said coolly. "You are her great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter." Pink lightning flared in the live white rabbit's eyes. "You killed the old lady so you could take over her carrot farm," continued Fred Fox, "and then you killed Hoot Owl." "I'll kill you too, Seamus," shrieked Daphne Rabbit. "Put the cuffs on her, Sergeant," barked Inspector Mastiff. Sergeant Dachshund put a pair of handcuffs on the front legs of the dead rabbit. "Not her, you dumb kraut," yelped Inspector Mastiff. It was too late. Daphne Rabbit had jumped through a window pane and run away with the sergeant in hot pursuit. "All white rabbits look alike to me," growled Inspector Mastiff. "How could you tell them apart? From their ears?" "No," said Fred Fox, "from their years. The white rabbit that called on me darn near beat me to the lily pad, and no old woman can do that." "Don't brag," said Inspector Mastiff. "Spryness isn't enough. What else?" "She understood expressions an old rabbit doesn't know," said Fred Fox, "like hop the hutch, and throb, and skip it, and sap." "You can't hang a rabbit for her vocabulary," said Inspector Mastiff. "Come again." Fred Fox pulled the snapshot out of his pocket. "The white rabbit who called on me told me Daphne was 18 months old," he said. "But read what it says on the back of this picture." Inspector Mastiff took the snapshot, turned it over, and read, "Daphne on her 2nd birthday." "Yes," said Fred Fox, "Daphne knocked 6 months off her age. You see, Inspector, she couldn't read the writing on the snapshot because those weren't her spectacles she was wearing." "Now, wait a minute," growled Inspector Mastiff. "Why did she kill Hoot Owl?" "Elementary, my dear Mastiff," said Fred Fox. "Hoot Owl lived in an oak tree, and she was afraid he saw her burrowing into the club last night, dragging Grandma. She heard Hoot Owl say, 'I'm wise, I know everything,' and so she killed him." "What with?" demanded the inspector. "Her right hind foot," said Fred Fox. "I was looking for a concealed weapon, and all the time she was carrying her heavy blunt instrument openly." "Well, what do you know?" exclaimed Inspector Mastiff. "Do you think Hoot Owl really saw her?" "Could be," said Fred Fox. "I happen to think he was bragging about his wisdom in general, and not about a particular piece of information. But your guess is as good as mine." "What did you pick up in the cloakroom?" squeaked Ben Rat. "The final strand in the rope that will hang Daphne," said Fred Fox. "I knew she didn't go in there to hide. She went in there to look for something she lost last night. If she'd been frightened, she would have hidden when the flies went out, but she went in there after the flies lighted up again." "That adds up," said Inspector Mastiff grudgingly. "What was it she was looking for?" "Well," said Fred Fox, "she heard something drop in the dark when she dragged Grandma in there last night, and she thought it was a button, or a buckle, or a bead, or a bangle, or a brooch that would incriminate her. That's why she rang me in on the case. She couldn't come here alone to look for it." "Well, what was it, Fox?" snapped Inspector Mastiff. "A carrot," said Fred Fox, and he took it out of his pocket. "Probably fell out of old Mrs. Rabbit's reticule, if you like irony." "One more question," said Inspector Mastiff. "Why plant the body in the lily pad?" "Easy," said Fred Fox. "She wanted to throw suspicion on the croaker, a well-known lady killer." "Nong," rumbled Franz Frog. "Well, there it is, Inspector," said Fred Fox, "all wrapped up for you and tied with ribbons." Ben Rat disappeared into a wall. Franz Frog hopped back to his office. "Mercy," cried Sherman Stork. "I'm late for an appointment." He flew to the front door and opened it. There stood Daphne Rabbit holding the unconscious form of Sergeant Dachshund. "I give up," she said. "I surrender." "Is he dead?" asked Inspector Mastiff hopefully. "No," said Daphne Rabbit. "He fainted." "I never have any luck," growled Inspector Mastiff. Fred Fox leaned over and pointed to Daphne's right hind foot. "Owl feathers," he said. "She's all yours, Inspector." "Thanks, Fox," said Inspector Mastiff. "I'll throw something your way someday." "Make it a nice plump Plymouth Rock pullet," said Fred Fox, and he sauntered out of the lily pad. Back in his office, Fred Fox dictated his report on the White Rabbit caper to his secretary, Lura Fox. "Period. End of report," he said finally, toying with the emerald stick pin he had taken from Franz Frog's green necktie when the fireflies went out. "Is she pretty?" asked Lura Fox. "Daphne? Quite a dish," said Fred Fox, "but I like my rabbits stewed, and I'm afraid little Daphne is going to fry." "But she's so young, Fred," cried Lura Fox. "Only 18 months. "You weren't listening," said Fred Fox. "How did you know she wasn't interested in Franz Frog?" asked Lura Fox. "Simple," said Fred Fox. "Wrong species." "What became of the candy, Fred?" asked Lura Fox. Fred Fox stared at her. "What candy?" he asked blankly. Lura Fox suddenly burst into tears. "She was so soft and warm and cuddly, Fred," she wailed. Fred Fox filled a glass with rye, drank it slowly, set down the glass, and sighed grimly. "Sour racket," he said. My Own 10 Rules for a Happy Marriage. Nobody, I hasten to announce, has asked me to formulate a set of rules for the perpetuation of marital bliss and the preservation of the tranquil American boudoir and inglenook. The idea just came to me one day when I watched a couple in an apartment across the court from mine, gesturing and banging tables and throwing objet d'art at each other. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was obvious as the shot put followed the hammer throw that he and or she, as the lawyers would put it, had deeply offended her and or him. Their apartment, before they began to take it apart, had been quietly and tastefully arranged. But it was a little hard to believe this now, as he stood there by the fireplace, using an andiron to bat back the Royal Doulton figurines she was curving at him from her strongly entrenched position behind the Davenport. I wondered what had started the exciting but costly battle, and brooding on the general subject of husbands and wives, I found myself compiling my own 10 rules for a happy marriage. I have avoided the time-worn admonitions such as praise her new hat, share his hobbies, be a sweetheart as well as a wife, and don't keep a blonde in the guest room, not only because they are threadbare from repetition, but also because they don't seem to have accomplished their purpose. Maybe what we need is a brand new set of rules. Anyway, ready or not, here they come, the result of 50 years, I began as a little boy, spent in studying the nature and behavior, mistakes and misunderstandings of the American male, Homo americanus, and his mate. Rule 1. Neither party to a sacred union should run down, disparage, or badmouth the other's former girls or beaux, as the case may be. The tendency to attack the character, looks, intelligence, capability, and achievements of one's mate's former friends of the opposite sex is a common cause of domestic discontent. Sweetheart slurring, as we will call this deplorable practice, is encouraged by a long spell of gloomy weather, too many highballs, hangovers, and the suspicion that one's spouse is hiding and finding letters in a hollow tree, or is intercepting the postman, or putting in secret phone calls from the corner drugstore. These fears almost always turn out to be unfounded, but the unfounded fear, as we all know, is worse than the founded. Aspersions, insinuations, reflections, or just plain cracks about old boyfriends and girlfriends should be avoided at all times. Here are some of the expressions that should be especially eschewed. That waffle-fingered minor league third baseman you latched onto at Cornell. You know the girl I mean, the one with the hips who couldn't read. That old flame of yours with the vocabulary of a hoot owl. And you remember her, that old bat who chewed gum and dressed like Daniel Boone? This kind of derogatory remark, if persisted in by one or both parties to a marriage, will surely lead to divorce, or at best a blow on the head with a glass ashtray. Rule 2. A man should make an honest effort to get the names of his wife's friends right. This is not easy. The average wife who was graduated from college at any time during the past 30 years keeps in close touch with at least 7 old classmates. These ladies, known as the girls, are named respectively Mary, Marion, Melissa, Marjorie, Maribel, Madeline, and Miriam, and all of them are called Myrtle by the careless husband we are talking about. Furthermore, he gets their nicknames wrong. This, to be sure, is understandable, since their nicknames are, respectively, Molly, Muffy, Missy, Midge, Mabby, Maddie, and Mims. The careless husband, out of thoughtlessness or pure cussedness, calls them all Muggs, or, when he is feeling particularly brutal, Mucky. All the girls are married, one of them to a Ben Tompkins, and as this is the only one he can remember, our hero calls all the husbands Ben or Tompkins, adding to the general annoyance and confusion. If you are married to a college graduate, then try to get the names of her girlfriends and their husbands straight. This will prevent some of those interminable arguments that begin after Midge and Harry, not Mucky and Ben, have said a stiff goodnight and gone home. Rule 3. A husband should not insult his wife publicly at parties. He should insult her in the privacy of the home. Thus, if a man thinks the soufflés his wife makes are as tough as an outfielder's glove, he should tell her so when they are at home, not when they are out at a formal dinner party where a perfect soufflé has just been served. The same rule applies to the wife. She should not regale his men friends or women friends with hilarious accounts of her husband's clumsiness, remarking that he dances like a 1907 Pope Hartford, or that he locked himself in the children's rabbit pen and couldn't get out. All parties must end finally, and the husband or wife who has revealed all may find that there is hell to pay in the taxi going home. Rule 4. The wife who keeps saying, "Isn't that just like a man?" and the husband who keeps saying, "Oh, well, you know how women are likely to grow farther and farther apart through the years. These famous generalizations have the effect of reducing an individual to the anonymous status of a mere unit in a mass. The wife who, just in time, comes upon her husband about to fry an egg in a dry skillet should not classify him with all other males, but should give him the accolade of a special distinction. She might say, for example, "George, no other man in the world would try to do a thing like that." Similarly, a husband watching his wife laboring to start the car without turning on the ignition should not say to the gardener or a passerby, "Oh, well, you know," etc. Instead, he should remark to his wife, "I've seen a lot of women in my life, Nellie, but I've never seen one who could touch you." Certain critics of this rule will point out that the specific comments I would substitute for the old familiar generalities do not solve the problem. They will maintain that the husband and wife will be sore and sulky for several days, no matter what is said. One wife, reading Rule 4 over my shoulder, exclaimed, "Isn't that just like a man?" This brings us right back where we started. Oh, well, you know how women are. Rule 5. When a husband is reading aloud, a wife should sit quietly in her chair, relaxed but attentive. If he has decided to read the Republican platform, an article on elm blight, or a blow-by-blow account of a prize fight, it is not going to be easy, but she should at least pretend to be interested. She should not keep swinging one foot, start to wind her wristwatch, file her fingernails, or clap her hands in an effort to catch a mosquito. The good wife allows the mosquito to bite her when her husband is reading aloud. She should not break in to correct her husband's pronunciation, or to tell him one of his socks is wrong side out. When the husband has finished, the wife should not lunge instantly into some irrelevant subject. It's wiser to exclaim, "How interesting," or at the very least, "Well, well." She might even compliment him on his diction and his grasp of politics, elm blight, or boxing. If he should ask some shrewd question to test her attention, she can cry, "Good heavens," leap up and rush out to the kitchen on some urgent, fictitious errand. This may fool him, or it may not. I hope, for her sake and his, that it does. Rule 6. A husband should try to remember where things are around the house so that he does not have to wait for his wife to get home from the hairdresser's before he can put his hands on what he wants. Among the things a husband is usually unable to locate are the iodine, the aspirin, the nail file, the French vermouth, his cufflinks, studs, black silk socks and evening shirts, the snapshots taken at Nantucket last summer, his favorite recording of Kentucky Babe, the borrowed copy of The Road to Milltown, the garage key, his own towel, the last bill from Brooks Brothers, his pipe cleaners, the poker chips, crackers, cheese, the whetstone, his new raincoat, and the screens for the upstairs windows. I don't really know the solution to this problem, but one should be found. Perhaps every wife should draw for her husband a detailed map of the house, showing clearly the location of everything he might need. Trouble is, I suppose, he would lay the map down somewhere and not be able to find it until his wife got home. Rule 7. If a husband is not listening to what his wife is saying, he should not grunt, "Okay," or "Yeah, sure," or make little affirmative noises. A husband lost in thought or worry is likely not to take in the sense of such a statement as this. "We're going to the Gordons for dinner tonight, John, so I'm letting the servants off. Don't come home from the office first. Remember, we both have to be at the dentist's at 5, and I'll pick you up there with the car." Now, an okay or a "yeah, sure" at this point can raise havoc if the husband hasn't really been listening. As usual, he goes all the way out to his home in Glenville, 13 miles from the dentist's office and 17 miles from the Gordons' house, and he can't find his wife. He can't find the servants. His wife can't get him on the phone because all she gets is the busy buzz. John is calling everybody he can think of, except, of course, the dentist and the Gordons. At last he hangs up, exhausted and enraged. Then the phone rings. It is his wife, and here let us leave them. Rule 8. If your husband ceases to call you Sugarfoot or Candy Eyes or Cutie Fudge Pie during the first year of your marriage, it is not necessarily a sign that he has come to take you for granted or that he no longer cares. It is probably an indication that he has recovered his normal perspective. Many a young husband who once called his wife Tender Mittens or Taffy Ears or Rose Lips has become austere or important, like a common pleas judge, and he wouldn't want reports of his youthful frivolity to get around. If he doesn't call you Dagmar when your name is Daisy, you are sitting pretty. Rule 9. For those whose husbands insist on pitching for the married men against the single men at the 4th of July picnic of the First M.E. Church, I have the following suggestion. Don't sit on the sidelines and watch him. Get lost. George is sure to be struck out by a 14-year-old boy, pull up with a Charlie horse running to first, and get his teeth knocked out by an easy grounder to the mound. When you see him after the game, tell him everybody knew the little boy was throwing illegal spitballs, everybody saw the first baseman spike George, and everybody said that grounder took such a nasty bounce even Phil Rizzuto couldn't have fielded it. Remember, most middle-aged husbands get to sleep at night by imagining that they are striking out the entire batting order of the Yankees. Rule 10. A wife's dressing table should be inviolable. It is the one place in the house a husband should get away from and stay away from. And yet the average husband is drawn to it as by a magnet, especially when he is carrying something wet, oily, greasy, or sticky, such as a universal joint, a hubcap, or the blades of a lawnmower. His excuse for bringing these alien objects into his wife's bedroom in the first place is that he is looking for an old rag with which to wipe them off. There are no old rags in a lady's boudoir, but husbands never seem to learn this. They search hampers, closets, and bureau drawers, expecting to find a suitable piece of cloth, but first they set the greasy object on the dressing table. The aggrieved wife may be tempted, following this kind of vandalism, to lock her bedroom door and kick her husband out for good. I suggest, however, a less stringent punishment. Put a turtle in his bed. The wife who is afraid to pick up a turtle should ask Junior to help her. Junior will love it. Now, I realize, in glancing back over these rules, that some of my solutions to marital problems may seem a little untidy, that I have indeed left a number of loose ends here and there. For example, if the husbands are going to mislay their detailed maps of household objects, I have accomplished nothing except to add one item for the distraught gentleman to lose. Then there is that turtle. Captious critics will point out that a turtle in a husband's bed is not a valid solution to anything, but merely a further provocation. The outraged husband will deliberately trip his wife during their next mixed doubles match. She will thereupon retaliate by putting salt in his breakfast coffee. Two persons living in holy matrimony, I should have said long before this, must avoid slipping into blasphemy, despond, apathy, and the subjunctive mood. A husband is always set on edge by his mate's "far be it from me," or "be that as it may." This can lead to other ominous openings, "would God that," and "had I only had the good sense to," and the couple is then in the gloomy subcellar of the pluperfect subjunctive, a place in which no marriage can thrive. The safest place for a happily wedded pair is in the indicative mood, and of its tenses the present is the most secure. The future is a domain of threats and worries, and the past is a wasteland of sorrows and regrets. I can only hope in conclusion that this treatise itself will not start in any household a widening gap that can never be closed. The Interview. "Wonderful place you have here," said the man from the newspaper. He stood with his host on a rise of ground from where, down a slope to the right, they could see a dead garden, killed by winter, and off to the left, spare, grim trees stalking the ghost of a brook. "Everybody says that," said George Lockhorn. "Everybody says it's a wonderful place," to which I used to reply, "Thank you," or "I'm glad you think so," or "Yes, it is, isn't it?" At 58, Price, I say what I know. I say that you and the others are, by God, debasing the word wonderful. This bleak prospect is no more wonderful than a frozen shirt. Even in full summer, it's no more wonderful than an unfrozen shirt. I will give you the synonyms for wonderful. Wondrous, miraculous, prodigious, astonishing, amazing, phenomenal, unique, curious, strange. I looked them up an hour ago because I knew you would say this is a wonderful place. Apply any of those words to that dahlia stalk down there. "I see what you mean," said Price, who was embarrassed and began looking in his pockets for something that wasn't there. "I have known only a few wonderful things in my 58 years, said Lockhorn. "They are easy to enumerate, since I have been practicing up to toss them off to you casually. The body of a woman, the works of a watch, the verses of Keats, the structure of the hyacinth, the devotion of the dog. Trouble is, I tossed those off casually for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch man, or the Rochester Times-Union man. It's cold out here. Shall we go inside?" "Just as you say," said the interviewer, who had reached for the copy paper and the pencil in his pocket, but didn't bring them out. "It's bracing out here, though. You're freezing to death without your hat and overcoat, and you know it," said Lockhorn. "It's late enough for a highball. Do you drink cocktails?" "No, sir. That is, not often," said Price. "You're probably a liar," Lockhorn said. "Everybody replies to my questions the way they think I want them to reply. You can say that I say everybody they. I hate everybody he. Has everybody brought his or her slate, a teacher of mine, a great goat of a woman, used to ask us? There is no other tongue in the world as clumsy as ours is, with its back to certain corners. That's been used, too, and don't make notes, or don't let me see you make notes. Never made a note in my life, except after a novel was finished. Plot the chapters out, outline the characters after the book has been published." "That is extremely interesting," said Price. "What do you do with the notes?" They had reached the rear of the house now. "We'll go in the back way," said Lockhorn. "I keep them around, tuck them away where my executor can find them if he's on his toes. This is the woodshed. We'll go through the kitchen. Some of my best character touches, some of the best devices, too, are in the notes. Anybody can write a novel, but it takes talent to do notes. We'll go through this door. This is wonderful, said Price. I'm sorry, I mean... Let it stand, said Lockhorn. Wonderful in the sense of being astonishing, curious, and strange. Don't take the chair by the fire, he added as they reached the living room. That's mine. Lockhorn dropped into the chair by the fireplace and motioned his guest into another. Can I use that about the notes? Asked Price. Mr. Hammer wants something new. Make us both a drink, Lockhorn said. That's a bar over there. I drink bourbon, but there's scotch and rye, too. I'll have bourbon, said Price. Everybody has what I have, Lockhorn growled. I said scotch, and the Times-Union man had scotch. I said rye, and the Post-Dispatch man had rye. No, you can't use that about the notes. Tell it to everybody. Beginning to believe it myself. Have you gained the idea in your half-hour here that I am a maniac? Price, noisily busy with bottles and glasses, laughed uncomfortably. Everybody knows that your methods of work are unusual, he said. May I ask what you are working on now? Easy on the soda, said Lockhorn. Martha will raise hell when she finds me drinking. Just bow at her and grin. Price put 2 frightened squirts of soda in one glass and filled up the other. Mrs. Lockhorn, he asked, handing the strong highball to his host. What is this man Hammer like? Lockhorn demanded. No, let me tell you. He says remotely resembles. He says flashes of insight. He begins by God sentences with moreover. I had an English teacher who began sentences with to. There are other factors to be considered. The man says he read Macaulay, but he never got past page 6. Hammer, that is. Should have gone into real estate, subdivision, opening up suburbs, and so on. This English teacher started every class by saying, none of us can write. Hadn't been for that man, I would have gone into real estate, subdivisions, opening up suburbs, and so on, but he was a challenge. You can say my memoirs will be called I Didn't Want to Write. Lockhorn had almost finished his drink. I'll have to see a proof, he said. I'll have to see a proof of your article. Have you noticed that everybody says everything twice? They say everything twice. Yes, they do, you'll say. Yes, they do. Only contribution I've made to literature is the discovery of the duplicate statement. How the hell are you, Bill? A guy will say. How the hell are you, anyway? Fine, Bill will say. Just fine. That's very interesting, said Price, and feeling that his host expected it, he added, That's very interesting. Lockhorn held out his glass, and Price carried it back to the bar. The Times man, or whoever it was, Lockhorn went on, put down that one of the things I regard as wonderful is the feminine anatomy. You can't get body of a woman in the papers. The feminine anatomy is something that can be touched only with the mind, and you'll notice that in my list, everything can be touched by the hand. A watch a man never held would not be wonderful. That's true, said Price, speculating on the actual aspect of devotion. There is only one thing I've never told an interviewer, Lockhorn said after a pause. I've never told any interviewer about the game. Don't tell the man about the game, Mrs. Lockhorn always says. Promise me you won't tell the man about the game. Let me ask you one thing. Why would Martha ask me not to tell you about the game if there were no game? She wouldn't, of course, said Price, taking a long, slow sip of his drink to cover his embarrassment. The 2 men drank in silence for a while. My second wife left me because of the game, Lockhorn said, but you can't print that because she would deny it, and I would deny it. Lockhorn took a great gulp of his drink and stared into the fire again. 2 minutes of silence went by, during which Price found himself counting the ticks of the clock on the mantelpiece. My memory is beginning to slip, Lockhorn said, but if you print that, I'll sue Hammer's pants off. Maybe I'll sue his pants off anyway. Sunday editors are the worst vermin in the world. If you use that, credit it to Mencken. I don't know why the hell you boys want to interview me. I've said a great many sharp things in my life, but I can't remember which ones are mine, and which ones were said by Santayana, or John J. Chapman, or Bernard DeVoto. You can say my memory is slipping. Maybe it will arouse pity. I'm the loneliest man in the United States. Lockhorn had finished his drink very fast, and he got up and walked to the bar. Price's eyebrows went up as he heard the heavy slug of bourbon chortle into the glass. Martha'll be sore as a pup, Lockhorn said with an owlish grin. Just touch your forelock to her. You can't argue with her. She's my fourth wife, you know. The others were Dorothy, Nettie, and Pauline, not necessarily in that order. He came back to his chair and flopped into it. Price began to listen to the clock again. Lockhorn's head jerked up suddenly. Going to call my memoirs I Had to Write, he said. You can put that in your piece if you want to. When Mrs. Lockhorn came into the room, smiling her small, apprehensive smile, Price had just handed his host a seventh highball. This is Pricey, said Lockhorn. Price, who had jumped to his feet, stood bowing and grinning at his hostess. She barely touched him with her smile. One for the house, said Lockhorn, holding up his drink. It's early, said Mrs. Lockhorn. It isn't 5 yet. I must be going, Price said. May I make you a drink, Mrs. Lockhorn? No, thank you, she said, in a tone that corked the bottles. Nonsense, said Lockhorn. Sit down, Pricey. I've never by God known anything like the female timetable. They live by the clock. The purpose of 6 p.m. is to unlock their inhibitions about liquor. Sexual intercourse is for holidays. George, said Mrs. Lockhorn sharply. Price began to babble. Well, I guess it was us men, we men, who actually set a schedule for drinking with that business about the sun over the yardarm, wasn't it, Mr. Lockhorn? Sun over your grandma's thigh, said Lockhorn irritably, looking at Price, but aiming the phrase at his wife. Who called tea the 5 o'clock? Women, French women. They don't even believe a man should smoke until he puts on his tuxedo. We are a prisoner of the hours, Pricey, and you know it. Price flushed and became vastly conscious of his hands. Finish your drink, said Martha Lockhorn to Price. My husband is going to finish his, and then I'm afraid he must rest. The new book has taken a great deal out of him. You're goddamn tootin' he's going to finish his, said Lockhorn, his fingers whitening on the glass. And don't third-person me. Sit down, Pricey, we're just getting started. Price sat stiffly on the edge of his chair. He saw that Mrs. Lockhorn, who had moved behind her husband's chair, was trying to communicate with him by a shake of her head and a glance at the bar. Don't let 'em third-person you, Pricey, said Lockhorn sternly. Next comes the first-person plural. They first-person plural you to death. Then you might just as well go to bed and die. You might just as well go to bed and die. I hope he hasn't been entertaining you with imprecations all afternoon, said Mrs. Lockhorn. Oh, no, indeed, exclaimed Price, picking up his glass and setting it down. She loves the happy phrase, said Lockhorn. She spends more time on phrases than most women do on their hips. Don't be tiresome, George, said Mrs. Lockhorn. She turned to Price. You see, he has been interviewed constantly, she told him. It seems as if there has been an interviewer here every day since his novel came out. You all want something different, and then it never comes out the way he says it. It's all twisted and ridiculous. I hope to avoid that sin, said Price, noting that the famous author had closed his eyes but still kept his tight grip on his glass. He's terribly tired. Mrs. Lockhorn's voice was lowered to a whisper, as if they were in a sick room. He worked 4 years on the flaw in the crystal. Some of the reviews have hurt him deeply. It's selling wonderfully, whispered Price. Mrs. Lockhorn made a gesture with her hands, but its meaning was lost on him. The novelist opened his eyes and quickly finished his drink. I'll tell you some other wonderful things, he said. A woman crying, children calling over the snow, across the snow, dogs barking at a distance, dogs barking far off at night. He put his empty glass on the floor and groped in the air for more wonders with his right hand. Things I've wanted to do, he went on. You can use this, Pricey. Bat baseballs through the windows of a fire scraper, from a lower roof across the street. Spend... Skyscraper, said Mrs. Lockhorn. To Price's secret delight, his host, after a slow stare at Mrs. Lockhorn, repeated with great authority, "Fire scraper." He winked at Price. "I want to spend the night in Ovington's," he said. "I want to open a pigeon. All my life I've wanted to cut a dove open, looking for the goddamnedest omens in the history of the world."